So, welcome to the next edition of the Rare Business Podcast. With me today, I have Jean Bliss, who is the president of Customer Bliss, a 3-time best-selling author, and also one of the co-founders of the Customer Experience Professionals Association, no less. Hi, Jean. How you doing?
Hey, I'm good. So good to chat with you today.
You're very welcome. Now, Jean, for the benefit of our listeners and readers, can you tell us a bit about you and also a bit about the work that you do?
You bet. So I am a practitioner first. I started back in 1983 at Land's End and was the first architect really working with the executive team of the Land's End customer experience, and then moved to 4 other industries, to automotive, to Mazda, to residential real estate, to the franchise business, to Coldwell Banker, to Allstate Corporation, and then finally to Microsoft, all leading customer experience transformation as essentially the first chief customer officer. And after that, I started writing books, and my work is to work with the chief customer officer and the C-suite in transforming their business, because it can't just be about the individual role of the CCO. It's got to be about uniting with the C-suite to drive a change in how they run the business.
Okay. Now, on the back of that, I guess to support that, you've just recently published a new book recently published in the US, and it's being released in the UK in July, I believe. And it's called Chief Customer Officer 2.0, How to Build Your Customer-Driven Growth Engine. Now, there's 2 things. First is that there was originally a Chief Customer Officer book, and this is I guess a new version or an updated version or a completely different version, I guess.
It is, yes, it is 10 years later. The first Chief Customer Officer book was really based on my 25 years experience as a practitioner. The roadmap I wish I had on desk as I was pushing the rock up the hill trying to get this work done.
Right.
This new book is 10 years later, based on coaching the C-suite and chief customer officers around the world for the last 12 years, and it is a much more deliberate roadmap, a methodology, and a transformation toolkit, if you will.
Okay, and is that why you kind of wrote it? Is it to document kind of some of your experience?
I did. My methodology has gotten so much stronger and clearer in terms of specific actions and when to take them. And so I wanted to give people my updated toolkit. And to that end, it's basically 100% new content. Okay. So the first Chief Customer Officer book is a great intro to the role, but then this book is really the framework, taking it to the next level.
Okay. Now, before we get sort of stuck into some of the meat of the book, I guess first of all, what I'd ask is, can you tell me what you think, or what from your perspective, what is a chief customer officer and what do they do?
So a chief customer officer is someone who works across the organization to unite the operation of the business and the decisions of leaders to start with the perspective of improving customers' lives.
Okay. And
that is a perspective that isn't necessarily embedded or natural inside of silo-driven organizations.
Okay. And does that mean that they won't necessarily have their own sort of department or function that they're ahead of, or does it mean that they kind of do both?
It could be. It's variable, Adrian. Some companies have a chief customer officer who's kind of like Switzerland. They don't own anything, and they report to the CEO. That leaves them unhindered to really do the work of the CCO. Others come into it and they're leading marketing and they add it on, or I've seen situations where people are running sales and then add it on as well. The key is less about the role and more about the competencies, and if the person is able to have the competencies to unite the organization.
Okay. Now, you just mentioned competencies, and that leads me on to my next question, and also kind of back to the book as well, because in the book you identify 5 customer leadership competencies that you say will become the company's engine for growth, as part of this is what it takes to drive growth in this kind of world, and also kind of what it takes to fulfill that role. Can you tell me what those competencies are and give me a brief outline of each of the competencies?
Sure, happy to. And the reason I call them competencies is because a lot of the work around customer experience has been around running a survey score and reacting to it, or going out in the field and getting a piece of, anecdotal customer information and reacting to it. And as a result, all of the work around customers is reactionary rather than strategic. And so by embedding these 5 competencies, you create a regular cycle, which is why I call it an engine, to always be having the conversation about the customer's life and constantly guiding, moving, and making decisions about how to improve it to earn the right to growth.
Right.
So given that, and I'm going to go through these briefly for you.
Okay.
Competency 1 is honoring and managing customers as assets. And what that means is starting with what customers actually did. How much did your customer base grow or shrink? And I like to teach people to do this in whole numbers. We brought in 50,000 customers, but we lost 40,000 customers. So our net customer asset growth is only 10,000 customers.
Yeah.
So we need to start with what customers actually did and any behavioral shifts in the strengthening or loosening of the relationship versus what they say they might do in surveys. And this really grounds the work to return on investment, and that this is about growing the business.
Right. Okay.
Competency 2 becomes really what I'd like to think about and teach people is a guide to driving the organization from a leadership standpoint. It's really a business decision blueprint, meaning starting with the stages of the customer's journey and changing how you talk about the business versus going around the room and saying sales, operations, marketing, claims. And let's start with what is the new customer experience? What is the onboarding experience? So it's changing leaders' language and changing accountability, but changing how we unite silos to deliver complete experiences from the customer's standpoint. And this is really one of those critical transformation things, because without doing that, you go back to silo speak and silo metrics immediately.
Okay, fair enough.
Competency 3 is around building a customer listening path. Losing our dependency or our addiction really on survey scores, and instead uniting multiple sources of information to create convergence around what really are the powerful emerging opportunities or themes, meaning tracking and trending complaints, but managing and presenting it by stage of the experience. Same thing with your social media. Same thing with feedback customers voluntarily giving you as they return items, and then trending that from a volume standpoint, but mapping it to the stage of the experience, and then pairing that up with your survey score so you're telling the story of the customer's life. In stage 1, our complaints spiked this month. Our social media customers were very unhappy. And then the other piece of listening is experiential listening, meaning if customers are unhappy about something, go do it yourself, so that you can feel it and learn it. Right. And then finally core that up with the validation of the survey score. So yes, they're unhappy, and look, 2 months later, our survey scores validate that unhappiness. So we use multiple sources, map it across the stages, so we can be storytellers about customers' lives.
Okay, brilliant.
Competency 4 is what I call your proactive experience, reliability, and innovation methodology, and embedding this competency, meaning you should know the operational performance in the key intersection points with customers and know how you're doing in them before you even wait for survey scores. In other words, if there's a place where cycle time on delivering to a customer is critical to them feeling value or continuing to consider using you, you should know and ask about that from a leadership standpoint with as much rigor as you care about sales goals. Because where your performance in those intersection points go, so does your long-term growth and ability to deliver value. But yet those are things that are buried way, way down in individual scorecards or reported on from a silo standpoint. And so we need to shift leaders' thinking to be proactive in caring about those metrics.
Okay.
And then competency 5 is one company accountability and culture and decision making. One of the biggest Achilles heel of this work is that every silo may go in and cherry pick the results from survey whatever, and then they go off and work on things on their own. There is no uniting of leaders to make decisions, to determine and manage capacity. So one of the things that I encourage here is something we call a customer room, where we actually step leaders through the story of customers' lives on a monthly and quarterly and annual basis. And by stage of the experience, we start with the customer growth or loss, and then identify the emerging issues or opportunities, and have leaders in a united way pick one or two. And then they assemble cross-functional teams, but those cross-functional teams are picked by the leaders. And every month they have the cycle of presenting back in that customer room. Okay. This cycle of accountability changes culture, it unites the leadership team, and it brings the middle of the organization into that great opportunity of really having a chance to improve the business and the work they're doing.
Okay. I mean, all I can say is that listening to you kind of with all those kind of competencies, I'm thinking, phew, that sounds like a lot to do. Particularly if it's just like, if it's all embedded in kind of one role. I mean, the competencies almost sound like organizational competencies rather than just the competencies for a chief customer officer. Would I be right in saying that?
That's exactly right, which is why this has got to be about banding together the C-suite and the chief customer officer, because this isn't just about the tactics of doing journey mapping.
Yeah.
It's about, if you're going to grow, and that's why I call it a growth engine. If you're going to grow, this is about changing the whole operation. And in fact, when we kick this off, we actually have the C-suite. Let's say you've got, I'll do easy math, 10 people in your C-suite and 5 competencies. We actually assign different leaders to work with small core groups to build out their first beta version of each of these. They have their skin in their game and they're participating.
Okay. And so just in order to maybe bring this to sort of to life a little bit, I mean, do you have you've got lots of examples in the book, but could you share with us a couple of examples that you use in the book of firms that have followed this kind of path and sort of the challenges that they've overcome and the benefits they've achieved?
You bet. What I did for the book was I actually interviewed about 40 chief customer officers around the world, because this work is hard. Yeah. And we need to be able to empathize with each other. So one great example is a client I worked with. His name is Nick Frunze. He's the chief customer officer at Esri, which is the largest geospatial technology company. Well, what does that mean? That means if you're a gasoline company, you need to know where to put your gas stations. If you're a power company, you need to know where to put telephone poles. So they help corporations globally figure out where to put their assets of their business for optimization. And because they're a software as a service company, they gave customers technology credits. Well, they had a random rule in there that didn't really honor their customers, which was when you ran through your credits, before even anybody talked to you, there was an automatic shutoff switch. Right. So a customer's account, a huge global customer who was trying to, do some big job, suddenly had their whole technology application turned off. Well, you can lose the customer asset very easily by doing something random. And that was just some rule somebody wired into the software, right? But this is where companies lose growth. And so what Nick did with the team, because this involves a lot of areas, is they never turn off an account now without talking to them first, understanding and making sure that that account doesn't go away because of some random rule.
Okay.
But without the oversight of that, you don't see that. Go ahead. I apologize.
No, that's fine. I mean, that makes sense. I mean, it's like, sometimes there's all these little rules in processes and systems and particularly in kind of code that that the people have put them in for for good reasons, but actually kind of when you from a good reason from an organizational perspective, but from a customer's perspective, they don't necessarily make any sense, and it's only kind of when you actually unpick everything do you get real insight in terms of what sort of catastrophe they could cause in terms of the relationship you have with the customer.
Well, yeah, because I've had clients who lose, $50 million customer over, a $200 policy change. And these, I call them stupid rules, get put in place. And if you really are thinking about this as the asset of your business, we have to realize the lifetime value of these individual customers and make way for these silly rules, not to push these high volume customers or high value customers out the door.
Absolutely. So, do you have another example that you could share for us as well?
I do, around competency too, around a line around experience. One of the really fun case studies and chief customer officer folks I talked to was the gentleman who leads customer experience for the Smithsonian Institution. They have over 30 million visitors a year, and they, until this year, had never built a journey map. And so they spent a lot of time really focusing, building their customer journey map. And the powerful thing of this is that they built the stages from the standpoint of the customer, the visitor experience, starting with when I'm considering going on a trip, when I'm organizing a trip, when I'm arriving at the Smithsonian campus. And that has kind of galvanized their whole organization, because even naming the stages changes culture.
Right.
And I just think that's a fantastic example, because there's in the public sector, there is not a lot of government and organizations that are starting to think of, have thought about their business this way. So I love this shift of tide, even at the very, very highest level of the Smithsonian Institution.
Absolutely. No, that's a good example. So thinking about this it just more broadly in the competencies and everything else, I mean, do you think that, I mean, is the book also a kind of a challenge to kind of companies? I mean, are you kind of saying that every company should have a chief customer officer, or should be considering this type of kind of role, that and this type of change in sort of like change in strategy?
Well, that's a great question, Adrian. And in fact, the last chapter of the book is a series of questions that a company and leader should ask themselves to determine if they need it or not, right? The questions are around silos, the ability to deliver a united experience, how they're growing. Then in that back chapter, there's also the description of the chief customer officer role around the competencies, and even questions for candidates to ask, because a lot of companies will say they want one but aren't necessarily committed to the real work that ensues once you put a person in the role.
Sure.
I also created that chapter because I have recruiters calling me on a regular basis who are now filling these roles with not a lot of clarity around how to define it or even how to interview people for it.
Right. Okay. So this is kind of, it's there to kind of help them actually kind of define kind of what it is they're looking for anyway.
And decide if they're really ready for it, right? Because a lot of people say they want it. And, for me, I never see it as every company must have one. It's kind of a diagnostic process.
Sure.
How collaborative are you? How's your leadership team? Are you really starting the conversations with customers' lives, or are you really deeply embedded in silos? And it's a behavior change inside of an organization around how they do the work of the business.
Okay. So, not wanting to kind of go through the whole book, Jean, because, you want people to go and buy the book, obviously. But is there anything else that you'd like to add, sort of around this sort of the chief customer officer sort of subject, or top tips for people that are maybe thinking about it, or recruiting for it, or are in the role and they need to kind of do more? What would you say?
Well, what I did in the book was there's several things that are really helpful, and it's actually a complete toolkit. So I'm not just pontificating in this book. I'm actually giving them something called action labs all throughout the book, where they can start taking actions right away. And one of the most powerful ones is by stage of the experience, get your leaders in the room and have them define what we will always do and what we will never do to customers by stage of the experience. It becomes very kind of enlightening. But what you'll see there's an introduction chapter, there's a complete chapter on uniting the leadership team, but then there's one chapter of action plans around each of the 5 competencies, and at the back of that chapter is what I call leadership recipe cards.
Right.
Jump to those, because that will start to summarize, here's the behavior change you need leaders to take, because don't take this on your own without uniting that leadership team. Otherwise, as a chief customer officer, you're going to be a beggar, and that's not the job that you want. Please come to the meeting. Please review the information.
Excellent. So, in the interest of time, Jean, that's been great, but it brings me to my final question that I always ask at the end of these interviews, and the question is this. Is there anything that you would like to shamelessly plug? Well, I would love to have people just buy the book. It's really my pay it forward book. Okay.
I wrote it for all the customer experience professionals around the world who've been reaching out to me for all these years, and we've been having a ball. Buy the book, and then my website is going to be new in about a week and a half. It's customerbliss.com. So those two things, one and two, will give you a complete toolkit on driving this great work across your organization. And thanks for the question.
You're very welcome. So that's Jean. That's been great. I congratulate you on the kind of the book and pulling it all together. I'll make sure I get this all edited up and linked up, and so signpost people to your website and also the book. But just want to say thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the great voice you've been for our community.